On October 5, 1980, after 9 p.m., a woman's body was found south of State Route 146 near Arroyo Grande Boulevard in Henderson, Nevada. She was determined to be Caucasian and between the ages of 14 and 25 years old. She had suffered from blunt force trauma and multiple other significant injuries. The body was discovered by two brothers who were driving on a dirt road, one of whom was an off-duty police officer. The body appeared to have been washed, and a piece of yellow or orange shower curtain was nearby. The victim had dental fillings in some of her teeth and also had undergone an unusual suture procedure to straighten one of her teeth. She had a very small amateur tattoo of an S on the inside of her right forearm made with blue ink, which appeared to have been inked not long before she died. It was determined that she had probably died the day before her body was discovered. Her fingerprints were taken and her dental characteristics were recorded, but could not be matched to anyone. After not being able to identify her, she became known as Arroyo Grande Jane Doe. Eventually, her DNA profile was developed by the University of North Texas and was entered into national databases, which failed to turn up her identity. Several TV shows broadcast information about the case in the hope of generating leads, but none of them led to her identification or the arrest of her killer or killers. Forensic facial reconstructions were created to provide a likeness of the Jane Doe, which they hoped would increase the chances of someone recognizing her. The body has been exhumed 4 times for further investigations in 2002, 2003, 2009, and 2016. In 2003, her body was exhumed after authorities followed clues to a missing girl from California who was eventually ruled out by DNA analysis. Nearly 30 missing women were excluded as potential identities for the victim. On October 5, 2015, the 35th anniversary of her discovery, 2 new reconstructions were released and the new image replaced an older version that had been created. In 2016, her body was exhumed for the 4th and final time for additional testing. DNA and genealogy were used to help find her identity by tracking down possible family members, which then led to 2 sisters of the Jane Doe, and using their DNA, they were able to confirm the Jane Doe's identity. 41 years later, on December 2, 2021, the Henderson Police Department announced that Arroyo Grande Jane Doe had been identified as 17-year-old Tammy Corrine Terrell from Roswell, New Mexico. Tammy was born July 4, 1963, and was last seen on September 28, 1980, when she was dropped off at the Roswell State Fair that evening. Later that night, she was seen at a restaurant in Roswell with a white man and woman possibly planning to head for California. Her body was found a week later. She had been reported as missing to police at some point. Investigators believe that Tammy was a victim of sex trafficking and was dealing with a variety of personal struggles. The S tattoo she had recently received was possibly her branding related to trafficking. Some theorized that she may have been a victim of serial killers Gerald Gallego and Charlene Williams. The Gallego couple terrorized Sacramento, California between 1978 and 1980, who murdered many victims, mostly teens whom they kept as sex slaves before killing them. The investigation into her murder is ongoing, and police ask that anyone who knew Tammy or have information about the case to contact the Henderson Police Department or to remain anonymous call Crime Stoppers. As of today, Tammy's killer remains at large, but she now has her name back. On Valentine's Day, 1982, a trooper discovered the body of a young woman under a cedar tree by westbound Interstate 40 west of Williams, Arizona. The officer discovered the body while he had been looking for a blown-out tire from an automobile accident. She was badly decomposed and dressed in only jeans with a bra and sweater found nearby. Her belt loops were ripped and it appeared she had been dragged to the location she was found. The coroner determined that she had not been sexually assaulted and was estimated to be between 16 and 24 years old. It was determined that she had most likely died of suffocation. Sadly, she would become a Jane Doe known as Valentine Sally, as her DNA and description did not match any missing persons reports. However, a few witnesses came forward believing they had seen her alive just a couple weeks before. One waitress, Patty Wilkins, was working the graveyard shift at the Monte Carlo truck stop in Ash Fork, Arizona. She described waiting on a very attractive young lady with blue eyes. She said that she noticed her because it was unusual for young women to be there, and she felt compelled to check on her. She had been attempting to hitchhike from Arizona to New Jersey for a family issue. Sally was accompanied by a man, and they came in at 2 or 3 a.m. and left an hour later. The man appeared to be in his 50s or 60s and wore a cowboy hat with a peacock feather in it. Sally was complaining of tooth pain and asked the waitress for aspirin. The man she was with seemed concerned about her teeth, and the waitress thought he was Sally's relative. She often smiled at the waitress and appeared comfortable with the man. She even asked her if she needed help or if she wanted to go with the truck driver, and the girl said she wanted to go with the truck driver. When police showed her a photo of the clothes the girl had been wearing, a white sweater with red stripes and jeans, the waitress verified that was the girl she had encountered on February 3rd. Also, the fact that she had complained of a toothache and was given a baby aspirin verified it was most likely the same girl. The reason for this is because aspirin was found in her tooth that recently had drilling done for a root canal just weeks prior to her death. But this lead turned up no clues to her identity, as no dentist in the area recognized her. Sadly, her face was unrecognizable due to animal activity. A North Arizona University student said that he picked up a hitchhiker fitting Valentine Sally's description near Cortez Junction on February 2nd, a day before the waitress saw her while traveling north. She told the driver that she was coming from Phoenix, where she was living with friends and working as a dishwasher. She said she was going because of some family problems, and she had to get to New Jersey. She was planning to go to the Little America truck stop when she got to Flagstaff to try and get a ride from a truck driver to the East Coast. It is possible she went to a dentist in the Phoenix area before February 2nd, 1982. Valentine Sally was misidentified in 1984 as a Melody Cutlip, a Florida girl who ran away in 1980. In 1984, a lieutenant with the Cocosino County Sheriff's Office thought it was her after finding her missing persons report. He contacted forensic odontologists to see if he could match the two. The odontologist matched the bite marks of Valentine Sally to dental records of Cutlip's teeth. However, his methods were unorthodox, never scientifically proven to be reliable, and outside accepted dental identification practices. He would use these methods to make at least one more false identification in the future. Melody's mother declined an offer to have the body sent to Florida for burial, as she did not believe it was Melody. Patty, the waitress who saw Valentine Sally at a truck stop, had a benefit to pay for her proper burial at the Williams Cemetery. Her headstone was engraved Melody Cutlip with Sally Valentine underneath. Shockingly, Melody returned home in 1986, 6 years after she had run away from home. She would later die in a car accident in Louisiana in 1998. Valentine Sally's tombstone bore Melody's name despite the request from the family to remove it. Through funding through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a sample of her DNA was acquired. The DNA profile was then uploaded to a DNA database. Through investigative genetic genealogy, siblings were located in Missouri that reported that their sister had run away in either Christmas 1981 or New Year's of 1982 after a fight with one of her 6 siblings. On February 22, 2021, 39 years later, it was announced that Valentine Sally was identified as Carolyn Celeste Eaton. Carolyn was born October 1, 1964 to Donald and Isla. She was a 17-year-old girl from a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. Her father died when she was 14 years old, and she was described as a troubled teen. It's unclear if her family reported her missing, but an official missing persons report was never filed. Police report that they have leads in her murder, which are not being released at this time. It is believed that she was murdered as soon as she left the truck stop in those early morning hours of February 3, 1982, but the motive is unknown. Although Carolyn now has her name back, the identity of her killer is still unknown. On July 24, 1989, human remains were found on the northwest shore of Fire Island, a tiny island off the coast of Anchorage, Alaska. An autopsy determined that the victim was a Caucasian male between 35 and 50 years old. Evidence was found on the remains that indicated the death was criminal in nature. An anthropologist estimated that the remains had been lying exposed on the beach for at least a year, but an approximate date of death could not be accurately determined. Undisclosed evidence on the body showed he had been murdered, but it's unclear if his body washed up on the island or if he was murdered on the island. Fire Island is uninhabited and is only 5.5 miles in length and used primarily as a wind farm. All efforts to identify the victim were unsuccessful, and he became known as Fire Island John Doe. His remains stayed in the morgue for months while investigators tried to determine his identity, and he was eventually buried in Anchorage Municipal Cemetery. In 2002, his DNA samples were sent to CODIS, but no matches were found. In 2003, hair and tissue samples that had been collected during the autopsy were sent to the FBI lab in Virginia, where a DNA profile was developed. The profile was entered into the National Missing Persons database, but again, no identification was made. In 2021, Othram scientists were able to extract DNA from the skeletal remains and develop a comprehensive DNA profile. Genealogy research indicated that the victim might be Michael Allison Beavers. He was a heavy equipment operator, and he owned an excavation business in Chugiak, a rural community about 20 miles outside of downtown Anchorage. According to troopers, his wife told authorities he left his home in Chugiak in late November 1979 for a 2,300-mile drive to Seattle, Washington, where he was planning to meet with a business associate, but he never arrived. Michael's wife reported him missing to the Anchorage Police Department in January 1980, 2 months after he left for Seattle, because he never returned. No information was developed to indicate what had become of 41-year-old Michael, and the investigation was closed 2 years after he went missing, and he was declared deceased 10 years after he went missing. Investigators located a close blood relative of Michael's and obtained a reference DNA sample. On December 1, 2021, 32 years after his disappearance, Alaska State Troopers announced that Fire Island John Doe was identified as Michael Allison Beavers. Despite leaving for a 2,300-mile road trip, his remains were found only 30 miles from where he left home. Investigators still continue to try and determine his cause of death. On June 26, 1992, human remains were found in plastic bags in an alley behind the I Love New York pizza parlor at 1288 Midland Avenue in Yonkers, New York, about a block from the New York Thruway. A construction worker discovered the body in a dumpster while searching for a lost lottery ticket. They were unable to identify the body, and she would remain unidentified for 29 years. In 2021, the FBI was able to link her to a cousin who had used a genealogy website. On December 7, 2021, Carl Koppelman, known for his reconstructions of John and Jane Does, announced the identity of Yonkers Jane Doe. She was identified as 31-year-old Meresa Hammonds of New Jersey. Meresa was born in Kentucky in April 1961 and was one of 7 children. She grew up in California and as an adult moved to Michigan before relocating to New Jersey, where she and her sister worked as fashion models. She was the mother of 2 sons at the time and fell on hard times and became estranged from her family. Sadly, her sons had no idea she was deceased and assumed she was living her life and not looking for them all that time. In 1996, serial killer Robert Schulman of Long Island was convicted of her murder. He confessed to killing her after being arrested, stating he picked her up and brought her to his apartment, where they smoked crack cocaine. He claimed that when he woke up, he found her dead. He was arrested after detectives received information about a man driving a blue Cadillac who had been cruising the area. Due to his blue Cadillac and Kelly Sue Bunning being murdered, sex workers were able to take detectives directly to his residence. Shulman, while working as a postal worker, picked up 5 prostitutes, got high on crack, and killed them. He would then dispose of their parts in garbage bins along Long Island, New York, and Yonkers, New York. He was originally sentenced to death, but his sentence was changed to life without parole after the New York Court of Appeals invalidated the death penalty in 2004. On April 13, 2006, Shulman passed away of natural causes in prison at the age of 52. Meresa was the second victim of his to be found, and one of 2 of his victims who were unidentified. Now, the only victim of his yet to be identified is known as Medford Jane Doe, who was found on December 7, 1994, along the side of Long Island Avenue. He would confess to her murder and be subsequently convicted for it. Meresa's case was solved not only using genetic genealogy, but also the persistence of Detective John Geis of the Yonkers Police Department and others. Thankfully, after 29 long years, Meresa Hammonds has her name back. On October 15, 1983, a hunter checking and setting fox traps on a private plot of land outside of Rensselaer, Indiana, stumbled upon human skeletal remains. Authorities determined that the remains belonged to a white man between the ages of 18 and 26 years old. The man appeared to have previously broken his left femur, and several pieces of dental evidence, including caps and fillings, were identified in the victim's mouth. Clothes were collected from the area, along with a Zippo lighter and the name Arlene engraved on the side. His death was ruled a homicide, and it was determined that he had been dead 1 to 2 years. Despite all of the clues identified by the coroner, the victim's description didn't match any missing persons reports, and no one stepped forward to identify the man. The most probable date of his death was estimated to be on or around November 20th, 1982. In 1994, more than 10 years later, serial killer Larry Eiler, who was already in prison, told his attorney he killed the John Doe. He said he picked him up one weekend in November 1982 along US 41 in the Vincennes area of Indiana and drove to Jasper County. He said the man was a hitchhiker and he offered him alcohol and a sedative, which rendered him semi-unconscious before he killed him. However, he wasn't able to provide any details or the identity of the victim. Eiler confessed to at least 22 killings before dying in an Illinois prison in 1994. In January 2021, Redgrave Research, a forensics company out of Massachusetts, approached the Jasper County Coroner's Office to offer assistance in identifying the John Doe. It took months to process the victim's DNA, but once it had finished, 6 days later, a potential candidate had been found. A DNA sample was taken from a full sibling of the candidate and was compared to that of the victim. This confirmed the victim's identity 38 years later as 19-year-old William Joseph Lewis, or Bill Lewis as he was known, of Peru, Indiana. Bill was born on October 13, 1963, and was described by his siblings as a quiet person. He was a football player in high school, but withdrew from school after he broke his left leg. He was last seen by relatives in February 1982 in Texas, attending a friend's funeral. From there, he was planning on hitchhiking home to Peru, Indiana. However, he never returned home, and his family spent decades searching for him. Years after the discovery of the remains, police officer Paul Ricker, who was the first officer on the scene after the remains were discovered, and other first responders raised money for a gravestone for John Doe at the Sailor McKeever Cemetery in Rensselaer. Bill's remains will now be moved and buried next to his father with a headstone bearing his name instead of John Doe. Two days before Christmas in 1975, a female's body was found in Davie, Florida, a town north of Miami. The victim was located floating in a canal north of Southwest 28th Street and 154th Avenue. She was wearing a green blouse, blue bell-bottom pants, open-toe platform shoes, and a white puka necklace made from bits of shells and a silver ring with a blue center stone. She was thought to be between 15 and 30 years old and had a gap between her upper and lower teeth, which were distinctively crooked. Months would pass without any relatives coming forward to claim her, so she became known as Broward County Jane Doe. She would be buried in a local cemetery, and the case would sadly go cold. Although a cause of death could not be determined and no trauma was noted, police were certain she had been murdered. In 2019, Davie detectives and crime scene techs began looking back over their old cases and thought they may be able to identify her through new DNA testing. They exhumed her body from the Forest Lawn Cemetery, and with the help of several other organizations, they were able to recreate a new sketch and began utilizing forensic genetic genealogy. On December 7, 2021, nearly 46 years after her discovery and years of hard work by detectives, Davie police announced the identification of Broward County Jane Doe. Carolyn Dunn Moudy was born December 24, 1953, and was found one day before her 22nd birthday. She was 21 years old when she disappeared from Indianola, Mississippi in July of 1974. Edna Moudy, who was only a year old at the time her mother went missing, finally has some answers as to what happened to her mother, although it's unclear how she ended up nearly 1,000 miles from home in that canal. On January 2, 2015, a man's deceased body was discovered on an access road between a Motel 6 and the Rohnert Park Expressway self-storage on Commerce Boulevard in Rohnert Park, California. Nearby was a black bicycle with multicolored speckles on its frame, with a child carrier attached containing a pile of loose pages with handwritten passages and lists and writings about scientific concepts and a lot of mathematical equations and formulas. There was also a red 7-inch Polaroid tablet, a Cobra camera in a case, 4 micro SD cards, 3 memory cards, and a micro solar panel. Sadly, a cause of death could not be determined. It was determined the man was between the ages of 40 to 55 years old. Some members of the Rohnert Park Library did believe they recognized him, but did not know his name. When his identity could not be determined, he became known as Rohnert Park John Doe, or 15 John Doe, as he was the first coroner case of 2015. In 2018, investigators developed a DNA profile for the man. It was sent to the DNA Doe Project, and the Department of Justice assisted in matching the genetic profile to the man's biological mother. On December 9, 2021, officials announced he was identified as a Seattle man named Stephen Patrick Archer. Stephen was born on January 7, 1966, and lived in Seattle, Washington in the 80s. He worked briefly for the Boeing Company in the 80s, and it's unclear when he arrived in Rohnert Park. His cause of death is still unknown, but authorities stated that it doesn't appear to be suspicious or involve foul play. It is believed that Stephen was highly intelligent but had become a transient and hadn't spoken to his family for more than 20 years. The only picture available at the time is his picture from the Tyee High School yearbook of 1983. Although his death may not be criminal in nature, he now has his name back and his family now has some type of closure. On February 14, 1988, a woman's body was found on a sidewalk near a junkyard off South Columbus Avenue in Mount Vernon, located a quarter mile from the Bronx in New York. She was naked and had ligature marks on her neck, wrist, and ankles. An autopsy determined she may have recently been involved in sexual activity, but it could not be determined if she was raped. The victim had a small amount of cocaine in her blood and broccoli in her stomach, and she had been strangled. The medical examiner estimated she was likely killed between midnight and 6 a.m., and she was found within a few hours of being posed on the sidewalk. When her identity could not be determined, she became known as Mount Vernon Jane Doe. In 2020, Detective Brent Gamble reached out to the FBI to see if genetic genealogy could identify her. Westchester Forensics Lab would be sent the DNA and determined there was sufficient DNA from the victim. In April 2021, after 33 years, her identity was determined to be that of Veronica Ronnie Wiederhold, a 19-year-old New York City resident. Veronica's relatives in Queens and Brooklyn had last seen her at the end of 1987. Her family tried to file a missing persons report, but there's no record of it, and surprisingly, she was found not terribly far from where her family lived. As of now, there are very little details available about her life, and her family has chosen not to publicly release photos, something we must respect. Now that her case is partially solved, hopefully her killer will be identified and brought to justice.